Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Minda de Gansburg Center for European Studies. I'm Grzegorz Ekiert. I'm Professor of Government and Director of the Center. Now, this is a Guido Goldmann lecture on Germany, which was established last year to celebrate the 80th birthday of Guido Goldmann. And we are very fortunate that the first speaker in this lecture will be Sigmar Gabriel. I have no doubts that there is no one more important in shaping German-American relations in the last half a century than Guido Goldmann. Der Spiegel called him a transatlantic titan. It was Guido who imagined and created the German Marshall Fund of the US. The fund was announced by Willy Brandt at Harvard in 1972 and became the most important vehicle in building German-American relations. As many of you know very well, Guido transformed Harvard into a powerhouse of European studies by funding the Center for European Studies in 1969 and by securing resources for our activities like this one, including this magnificent building in which the center lives. Now, Guido single-handedly created academic infrastructure that has shaped the knowledge of Europe and Germany in the US and beyond. He not only raised amazing amount of funds to support hundreds of PhD students and undergraduates at Harvard, but he also came up with the idea of centers of excellence in German and European studies. That those centers now, for like 20 years in many places, have been really transforming the knowledge of thousands of American students in top American universities. It would be no exaggeration to say that almost every academic working on Germany and Europe in the US benefited from Guido's life work in support of European studies. Thank you, Guido. We are all in your debt. Let me now turn the floor to another transatlantic titan who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Please welcome Professor Karl Kaiser.
As Gregor said, I'm Karl Kaiser. I'm an associate of this center. I have been present at the creation, so to speak, for quite a long time, and it is really a great pleasure to chair this meeting in honor of my friend Guido Goldmann. Our friendship goes back to the 1960s when both of us worked for Henry Kissinger, and I watched Guido starting all these activities that have been mentioned and which resulted in this extraordinary achievement that we have turned this institution into the most important center for European studies in the United States. We are very grateful. Harvard is grateful. I think Guido is grateful. Those of us who want to honor Guido are grateful that we have one of the leading political personalities of Germany to give the first and inaugural lecture, Sigmar Gabriel. Like many German politicians who moved to the top, he's gone through lots of different kinds of political experiences and responsibilities. He was Prime Minister of the land of Lower Saxony. He was Federal Minister of the Environment. He was Federal Minister for Economics and Energy. He was Vice Chancellor for a number of years. He was Foreign Minister in 2017 and 2018. And of course, he was chairman of the Social Democratic Party for a total of 8 years, longer than Willy Brandt. In other words, our speaker has lived through all the great events and crises of Europe, of Germany, in the post-war period, in particular since unification. From the financial crisis, where he had, of course, special responsibilities, to the reaction of Germany and the European Union and the West to the Russian annexation of Crimea and the intervention in the Ukraine. And policy toward Russia has always been one of his special interests. Sigmar Gabriel is one of the politicians who is very open and doesn't hesitate to address controversial subjects. For example, he told the Chinese that the time had come to apply reciprocity in relations with the West before Donald Trump did so. But most important, he had responsibilities at the time when Germany grew into what it is today, namely a major actor in international politics, in European politics. He lived through and helped to shape the German reaction in some of the major crises of the European Union. And we are very grateful that he will address that age-old question, which Thomas Mann, of course, many years ago raised, how Germany and Europe relate to each other. And he will do that at a time when many of us watch the events in Germany, with the Chancellor that has been in office for so long leaving, with lots of commentators arguing, is Germany turning into a country of instability? Hopefully he will give us some answers to these questions, but in particular to the European vocation of the country. So, sir, the floor is yours.
So, dear director, dear Elaine, where is she? She's always taking care about me. Dear Karl Kaiser, and of course, dear Mr. Goldman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be invited to have the first speech on the Guido Goldman lecture here. For different reasons, maybe I can give you some ideas why it is so special for me. But let me first say thank you very much, Karl Kaiser, for saying what I have been. So it shows me how old I am. And that's maybe something I should realize more often than I did before. It is really a great honor to be here, deeply appreciated, and Guido Goldman is a towering figure, towering because he established, as we heard, and inspired this marvelous place, the Center for European Studies. Very remarkable also because he managed to convince a penny-pinching German finance minister, by the way, we always have such finance ministers, but a social democrat to boot, namely Alex Möller, to create the German Marshall Fund, given where Möller hails from Baden-Württemberg, which includes Swabia, which is, in respect to financial issues, the most difficult part of Germany. This is a really impressive achievement. What impressed me, however, most is Guido Goldman's long-standing and dedicated engagement for the European project and the part Germany should play in this. And this is exactly my topic today, Europe and the German question. I'm also pleased because, if we are honest, interest in Europe and a little less visible in Germany here in the United States has dropped significantly in recent years. Not only since the presidency of Donald Trump. This has many reasons, especially and not least in the current weakness of Europe. Let's be honest, we are not a factor in world politics. That too has reasons that I want to talk about later. But precisely because Europe today is judged rather critically, I would like to start with a very personal plea for Europe. For me, the project of European unification is a real treasure that can show us to what people are capable if they only want. For me, the European project is exemplary, a role model for all the regions around the world mired in war, in civil war, and apparently never-ending hatred. It is possible to move on to overcome terrible conflicts in only one generation. I grew up in a family where my grandmother still sang the song, "The Frenchmen with the red trousers." Frenchmen were for her the German arch-enemies. For my father, Poles were only second-class human beings. He called them Polacks, and this is why I really feel touched by my heart. For him, Jews were responsible for the Second World War, and he was a real Auschwitz denier until his last days. By the way, my eldest daughter is from her mother's side. Her grandmother is an Auschwitz victim. She was killed together with her husband in Auschwitz and were tortured by Mengele. So in my family, you can find both sides, the Auschwitz deniers and the Auschwitz victims. I think for my father, it would have been impossible to imagine that his son would hold a lecture on a person like Guido Geldman. And that's the reason it's really a great honor for me to be here. So it would have been inconceivable to them that we were able to become first partners in Europe and then friends in only one generation. Today, despite all the problems and challenges, there is no place on this planet where people with different histories, different ideas of what their nation should be, and different constitutions live more secure, democratic, free, and peaceful than in the European Union. The development was possible because courageous politicians have chosen the European project. Especially the United States was at the cradle of this almost unbelievable success story. That perspective had changed a bit when I met Donald Trump, and he had the imagination that Europe is something like a conspiracy against the United States. I said to him, maybe he should go into the Marshall Room of the White House, there is one, or you can find the famous speech of George Marshall, which he held here in Harvard. It was only 11 minutes, and then if he would be able to read it, then he would know, then he would understand that Europe was built in the interest of the United States, not because of charity ideas or something like this, in the interest of the United States, and because they wanted to change the situation in Europe, and it was all about preventing a third world war in Europe from nationalism and enmity, and once again causing unbelievable suffering on the continent and beyond. It was literally about life and death. And it certainly was not particularly popular in the populations of France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, or Italy to invite us Germans to the table of the civilized people of Europe. For only a few years had passed since the Germans had marched through these lands, murdering and burning. It took courage to invite Germany to build Europe. But again, it was all about preventing a third world war in Europe. And today, despite all the mistakes and inequalities, the European Union is an example of how peace is possible. The centuries of war on the European continent, which were mostly a conflict between the center, Germany, and the periphery, are only 70 years past. That is why I regard the European Union as something unique that needs to be preserved and protected. And that is why I see a very special responsibility for my country, for Germany, to whatever it takes to keep Europe united. But however, our Europe is now facing new, previously unknown challenges. Following the fall of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall, the bipolar world order with its Eastern and Western blocks seemed to turn into a unipolar world order, you can call it World Order 2.0, in which democratic capitalism with the United States as the hegemonial power prevailed. This was tantamount to the end of history, how the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama said 1992. Less than 30 years later, we can see that it is anything but true. The US is experiencing hegemonic overstretch and abandoning the global stage for the town hall dance floor. Old revisionist powers like Russia are intent to filling the resulting vacuum. And countries like China and soon India and the young Africa will staking their claims. We don't yet know what the world order 3.0 will look like, but Europe and Germany should not sit back and watch others develop it. Instead, Europe and Germany should boldly advocate its own ideas, seek allies, and promote their interests. Admittedly, the challenges facing Europe today truly are huge. First of all, there are internal tensions. In economic terms, tensions exist between North and South, somehow between creditors and debtors. Debates about debt sustainability and therefore restructuring looming ever large. Although they have clearly lost momentum, the French president's proposals to reform the Eurozone and Europe are remarkable, just as remarkable as they are controversial in countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and Finland. In political terms, there are tensions between Western and Eastern Europe, issues like the rule of law, freedom of the press, and the independence of the judiciary became continuous between countries like France and Germany on the one side and Poland and Hungary on the other. In terms of the rule of law, meeting contractual obligations, there is potential for conflict between Northwest Europe and Southeastern Europe. Signs of endemic corruption, bad governance, and the rise of organized crime, not just in countries like Slovakia or Malta, are alarming. The landscape will not change for the better when, as the Commission has just proposed, Serbia and Kosovo will join the European Union by 2025. Imagine what kind of European Union it could be if these countries, without changing their policy, would be members of the European Union and UK is leaving. This is really a different European Union than today. So there's plenty of demanding work to do within the European Union, but at the same time, the global political landscape is changing so quickly and so radically that even a far more united European Union would find it hard to face up to these profound challenges. The development of a global data-driven economy is putting Europe's and particularly Germany's traditional industry-based economic model under massive competitive pressure. Looming changes are literally disruptive. The application of methods of artificial intelligence might ultimately imply a departure from key factors that were underlying our economic success so far. Given Europe's fragmented research and investment scene, combined with a body of regulation neither designed to react swiftly to innovation and market developments, nor capable of handling the size of global players we need in Europe, are marking it fiendishly difficult for us to stay on top of changing global economic trends. Then the United States is abandoning the liberal order, which was built by itself. Balancing cost and benefits for the first time since World War II, it no longer regards the gains from its role as global power as sufficient to justify the costs. New powers are anxious to fill the void this is creating, particularly, of course, China. The new Silk Road initiative is something different than a sentimental journey down to the lane of Marco Polo. So certainly, since the last Congress of the Communist Party, we've been able to see that the country has increasingly come to regard its international position as being sufficiently stable for it to pursue a much more ambitious foreign and interest-based policy, thus securing its independence and exercising its economic, political, and I'm sure also military international influence. Such developments were bound to happen regardless or independent of the United States reassessment. This is because the world order established after World War II has for some time now failed to reflect the shift in power towards the world's more populous continents and countries. So, in some ways, China's aspirations are nothing less than normal, but they pose a particular challenge for us Europeans and for the Americans. There are also other powers pulled into the vacuum left by the United States and with it the West. Russia, Iran, Turkey, for example, are currently showing in Syria that we Europeans, aside from minor roles being assigned to the two Security Council members, France and Britain, can simply be ignored when it comes to the process of re-establishing the region. Nor do we Europeans play a role, or at best only a minor one, in other flashpoints in the Middle East. We have no say in the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, in the conflict on the Gulf, in Yemen, and sadly, in the Palestinian conflict. The bitter truth is, while we are holding speeches bemoaning the situation and calling for international law to be upheld, others are fundamentally shifting the axis of power in the region. And then there's Africa. The continent will double its population to 3 billion people by 2050 at the latest. In yet another of Europe's immediate neighborhoods, our influence is diminishing. Again, China is the country which has been spending years investing in Africa's infrastructure, raw materials deposits, and even education. For quite obvious purposes, we Europeans tend to see Africa as a problem continent. We interpret our role there more and more as an attempt to stem what we perceive to be a growing stream of refugees. China, in contrast, does not have to fear the arrival of a single African refugee and clearly regards Africa as a continent of opportunity. So as we can see, Europe's and Germany's future will be determined by far more than its ability to cope with its internal tensions. And it will only be possible to overcome the external challenges if Europe is more strongly united. But we are a long way at present from succeeding in either of these areas. Anyone who conducts a sober analysis of the situation in Europe will soon realize that the threat to Europe is only apparently a rising nationalism or populism. This is but an phenomenon of the real danger, our own inability to find the right answers to the challenges of our age. It is the political vacuum which allows the solutions presented by populists and new nationalists to take hold on Europe's societies. At present, we Europeans need to be particularly concerned about two conflicts: the conflict between the United States and Europe on international trade, and the conflict over the nuclear deal with Iran. For us, it seemed not to be only a conflict about the deal with Iran. I mean, the United States president just said that he wants to cancel the INF treaty. So I think the current administration wants to get rid of all the international agreements which constrains them in their military approach. I think mainly in the direction of China, not to Russia or not in Europe. But it's okay, the danger is that we are in front of a next nuclear arms race around the world. So I would say that ultimately that makes us weaker as Europeans, and no one will respect a weak Europe. Neither the strong players, the United States, Russia and China, nor the weak ones, such as many African nations. Europe will only be able to uphold its position in the world, its values and its interests, if we stand closer together than we have done, including in very uncomfortable and risky situations, as we did recently in Syria. Either we galvanize into action and try to shape this world ourselves, or we remain passive and succumb to being shaped by the rest of the world on the receiving end. For this reason, it is absolutely vital to start working resolutely on developing a common European strategy in the various fields of international policy, a policy that responds constructively to challenges as they arise from Russia, Turkey, China, and also the United States. Whether we like it or not, Donald Trump is president of the United States, and he may remain in office for more than one term. And while Trump bashing is easy, maintaining our transatlantic relations is much harder, but it's vital for our perspective as Europeans. The simple truth is, being in the crosshair of Trump is detrimental. Therefore, we have to re-establish over the long term a robust relationship with the United States. I mean, I think that hopefully the transatlantic cooperation will in future not be so difficult than it is today, but we should be absolutely clear about the fact that it will never be like it was before. It has also to do with the changement inside the United States. I mean, it was Barack Obama who said this speech about the pivot to Asia, and it's normal that because of economic developments and the access of power, of course, the United States are looking much closer to China than it did maybe 30 or 40 years ago. And when I'm right, in some years from now, the majority of the American citizens do not have any European roots. The majority will have their roots in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa. So in the country, the perspective to Europe will change. The question is, are we able to cooperate with these new United States of America and form a new transatlantic cooperation, what I would prefer very strong? I mean, there are criticism from the United States to China which are correct. Maybe it's not correct how the United States president should try to solve it or not to solve it, but it should be better to join hands between the United States and Europe to confront the Chinese with our criticism and to balance the power, not to bring China in a situation where we try to corner them, but to balance the power in the world. And therefore, United States and Europe should join hands. But it's a long way to do this. And I think that's something where we should work, although we have difficult times in the transatlantic situation today. Starting from this analysis, my firm belief is that Europe will need strategic capabilities it didn't need before. In order to gain a better understanding of our own role and the specific challenges, we need to start from the parallelogram of forces in which Europe is operating. I mean, for us, the last 70 years, we were in a very comfortable situation. I mean, we had all our opportunities to invest in our internal development and economics and social structure and culture and we had the chance to concentrate on ourselves. For the rest of the world, for the dirty jobs, we always had the Americans. And if it went wrong, we had somebody to blame. It was a very comfortable role, especially for Germany and for Europe. And now we are confronted with the United States of America, which would say, and every president would say this to Europe and Germany, now it's time that you should take more responsibility on your own. And I think we need a proper answer to this. For example, I'm not in favor of 2% GDP investment in the German army, but I would say 1.5 in the German army and 0.5 in the capabilities of Eastern Europe would be a correct answer to this question. And it would be astonishing for the Polish guys and for our colleagues in the Baltics that we as Germans would be willing to take responsibilities for the public good defense, which in the past only the United States was able to do. So I think we have to search for a different cooperation than in the past, because it will never be, we will never come back in the old times after the Second World War. So the liberal intellectual Ralph Dahrendorf once said the following scathing words about our continent. Europe has no real influence. At any rate, it has no European interest that could inform this influence. Dahrendorf said this in an interview back in the year 2000. Perhaps his words need a bit of explanation for today's audience, but briefly, I would say that Dahrendorf wanted to warn people not to expect too much from Europe in terms of foreign policy. His verdict came as no real surprise, as Europe was founded with an eye and managing in an inward-looking way European issues. Europe was not deemed to be a global player. Instead, as lessons drawn from the devastating world wars, some call them European civil wars, the aim was to secure peace and build prosperity within Europe. And it was a political decision of the United States that the United States at that time said the United States should be responsible for the majority of the defense policy of Europe because they didn't want to give us the capabilities, because they were afraid that we Germans, mainly we, that we will come back to the old nationalist times. And they didn't want to send their kids again to the Third World War to Europe. This was the reason why we were educated to be, I would say, vegetarians in geopolitical issues. Today, yes, we are Germans, we are the biggest vegetarians. I mean, not me, as you see, but I mean, today I would say it's very difficult to survive as the last vegetarian in a world full of carnivores. So I would not say that especially Germany should be a carnivore again, but maybe we have to learn to be flexitarians, to play a role. And if you look to my country, you can see that there is an idea which is very popular on the very left side and the very right side of the political spectrum. It's the idea that Germany and maybe Europe should develop itself like a global Switzerland, to be economically successful, but in international politics, we should withdraw ourselves. I would say this is a very dangerous idea, but it's popular, and it's necessary to explain to people that at the end of the day, this is a way which will create more difficulties for us than to be part of the international arena. So a role on the world stage was reserved in previous times to the European members of the UN Security Council, and of course to the US. I don't want to sound alarmist, but I truly do believe that the coming years will herald changes of the kind that probably only have to made only very rarely once in an epochal changes. You have to look back a long way to see what I mean. At the beginning of the 15th century, exactly 600 years from now, in the year 1418, the Portuguese Prince Henry the Navigator sent his ships out along the West African coast to discover the sea passage to India. The sailors embarked on this dangerous journey into the unknown out of a sense of adventure, certainly out of greed, but above all, out of a willingness to take risks in an unknown world. That marked the beginning of Europe's rise. For centuries, global history was dominated by European ideas. At roughly the same time, in the mid-15th century, China took the opposite position. The Emperor of China mothballed his fleet of treasure ships after more than 300 years of domination. His country had to cope with too many internal problems, and the Middle Kingdom seemed to enjoy enough prosperity and security with its neighbors was no issue. So this was at that time the global Switzerland. That marked the beginning of China's gradual disappearance from the global stage that would last 600 years. So what will historians 600 years from now write about the 21st century? What will they say in 600 years when they meet each other here in the Center for European Studies? That it saw the dawn of a new Chinese era and Europe's gradual decline? Or will historical documents tell the tale of a Europe that proved once again that it was ready to set out into a risky and dangerous world in order to uphold its global political interests in a fair competition with and respect for others? Our action over the next few years will determine the answers. What is clearly is that an ethical, justified foreign policy based on values to which we Germans and Europeans aspire will not be enough in order to thrive in a world dominated by economic, political, and military self-interests. This means that if Europe is to change, Germany in particular will have to change. So the German question is back on the table, but in inverted form. After 1945, this question was about tying Germany in and preventing the country from ever again trying to go it alone. Today, the question is about my country's willingness to shoulder more responsibility. We may have learned to do that, but only in economic terms. There are good reasons why my country has become a geopolitical teetotaler since the end of the Second World War, because whenever we weren't, the consequences for the world were disastrous. Over the years, however, we have become comfortable in this role, as I said, as a geopolitical vegetarian. But in this changed situation, we are too large a country to be able to always just shirk the issue. The direction Europe takes will depend very much on the attitude Germany takes. If we try to stay on the sidelines, economically significant but politically irrelevant internationally, Europe will stay weak. If we are willing to help develop a projection of European power, we will have to do so in a way that does not result in any renewed hegemonic goals. For 70 years, other people have kept us safe. Now we need to learn to do it ourselves. Certainly, we won't be able to keep out of it. As I say, the German questions, or rather, the questions for us Germans are back. Ladies and gentlemen, I admit to not having a crystal ball, or to paraphrase Yogi Berra, it's difficult to make forecasts, in particular if they concern the future. In any case, so much is in flux, and as a Chinese saying puts it, most of the players are carefully crossing the river by feeling the stones. Hence, I will treat you three scenarios of three possible new global systems emerging. First, the G0 world order. This is a world in which power are distributed so widely that no one has a clear leading role. The American political scientist Ian Bremmer described it like this: no single country or bloc of countries has political and economic leverage or the will to drive a truly international agenda. You might call it a sort of Westphalian Order 2.0, a new edition of the battle of sovereign states for hegemony and balance, which the world experienced between the end of the 30 Years' War and the end of the World War II. For a trading nation and middle-ranking power like Germany, such an uncontrolled or unregulated interaction of forces is incredibly dangerous. The step away from rules and regulation may appear to some as the continuation of individualization and international relations. In truth, it would endanger the very foundations of our security prosperity. The second is the G2 world. This would be a sort of new bipolar order driven by the rivalry of two superpowers, one of them being emerged China as a substitute for the Soviet Union of the Cold War era. In this scenario, China draws its sense of self from its historic self-image as a middle kingdom. The upheavals in the United States and Europe confirms its belief that its own model is superior. In view of the greatest promises of prosperity raised by the Chinese model, I'm not surprised that a number of countries, especially in Africa, are inclined to fall into line with China. And the third is the GX world. This world order also consists of numerous poles, although fewer than the G20 we are familiar with, and certainly different ones than the G7. The key difference to the G0, or the Hobbesian world order, would be the existence of binding rules and structures. These would prevent the interplay of the poles depending on the respective balance of power or on the skills of today's Metternichs and Palmerstons. Multipolarity coupled with a binding order would characterize or define the system. I'm sure you will not be surprised that my preferation option is world order number 3. Whether it has a chance of establishing itself depends not least on the part played in the European Union and in the US. I mean, it's an interesting thing that the new strategic option, they called it the National Security Strategy, which was published at the beginning of the year. They said that all these ideas of multilateralism are nonsense. The world, so this idea is an arena, and only strong nations have the ability and the right to survive. And mission defines coalition. This is something very different to what we call the Old West or NATO. But the paradox is, it's not only an idea of the new US administration here or the president. If you would wrap out the name United States of America in this national security strategy, and you would put in Russia or China or Turkey, they would applaud. This idea that only strong nations should rule the world, this is a very popular idea also in Russia, in China, or in all these autocratic countries. So I would say it is a dangerous strategy, and I hope that the political debates here in the country and as well in Europe would prevent us for such a development. But regardless of which direction the world takes, Germany and the European Union will only be able to survive if it defines its own interest and it projects its power. In fact, even if Britain leaves, one of the strongest bonds with the European continent could still be formed if the United Kingdom shared its strategic and security capabilities more with Europe than it does today. European defense initiatives tended to quickly arouse suspicions in the past in Britain about NATO. Maybe the position in the UK is changing. The fact that the European Union lacks the means of projecting its powers has meant that wherever the United States has drawn back, countries have turned not to Europe, but to other countries which they expect to offer more reliable sources of power. You can see that even the rebels against Assad, after the withdrawal of the United States from the Syrian conflict, they turned not to Europe, to their political allies. They turned their faces to Russia, although Putin is the strongest ally of Mr. Assad, because they hope that a power projection from there maybe is more able to help them than the European Union. So we are in the middle of realizing that our rivals are not asleep. Every few weeks, the Russian president held court in Sochi. His visitors are the Syrian president, followed by the Turkish, and finally by the Iranian leader. They celebrate victory in Syria, which those present felt was now secure. A German newspaper wrote, "Black souls at the Black Sea." The regional powers gathered in Sochi are not friends, but they do have some interests in common. They look both inwardly and outwardly to their historic greatness. And there are times when they are willing to invest a fair amount in showing the West who's calling the shots. You might say that they're willing to pay a sort of superpower tax for their enhanced power status, economic constraints, diplomatic condemnation, financial penalties. They are willing to accept quite a lot in order to document their aspirations to regional leadership and upholding their national sovereignty. We can see this in the way Russia is treating Ukraine. Then there is Iran pumping substantial resources into supporting militias and terrorists across the region in order to control neighboring states. And Turkey is also not afraid at all of conducting military operations or of confrontations with the United States in order to defend its interests, for example, against attempts to create a Kurdish state in the north of Syria. Syria has so far been the biggest prize attained by those three ancient empires, and we should be quite self-critical about this. Throughout the last 7 years, the West has failed to strike a balance between its highly ambitious demands and the resources it has dedicated to achieving those demands. Theodore Roosevelt once said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Our policy on Syria seemed to be based on the opposite motto: speak loudly and carry a small stick. When Europeans express their frustration at an opposition to the new US policies and the country's partial withdrawal from its responsibilities for the international public good, what they might actually be resentful about is the fact that this has revealed Europe's weakness. We are certainly seeing one thing very clearly: just how much of our burden was borne by the United States in the past. And Mr. Trump, every day he shows us the gap between our ambitions and our capabilities. Maybe that's the reason we are so angry about him. These patterns of withdrawal and replacement witnessed in the Middle East can also be seen in other parts of the world. We just need to look across Asia, where China is moving into areas which used to be dominated exclusively by the presence and the policies of the United States. But its strategy is a different one to that employed by Russia and its allies. Only once it has established a sound economic basis will it softly start creating military independencies. So far, at least. The One Belt, One Road initiative, the new Silk Road, is, as I said, not a nostalgic trip down to Marco Polo's lane, but a hardwired geo-economic strategy which will enable China to enforce its ideas of order in terms of trade, policy, geopolitically, and perhaps ultimately also military. It's probably fair to say that China seems to be the only country in the world which currently has a concrete, well-defined geo-economic strategy in place. That is not something we can criticize them for. On the contrary, I feel a sense of respect at the speed and power of the country's development over the last 30 to 40 years. But we of the old world deserve criticism for having failed to develop our own strategy. If we want to redress the balance, we will have to define our own interests. Better still, identify combined US-EU interests and place them next to China's. Only then we will be able to arrive at a viable and for us beneficial balance between all three sides. Against the background of the current differences with the United States, we must not be tempted to regard China's efforts to maintain a multilateral order as an altruistic endeavor. Over the last few years, China has become even more autocratic. Despite all the opportunities and possibilities, the country is facing gigantic internal challenges. At the same time, Europe has to tackle a truly Herculean task. Too many factors at once, wrote the German diplomat Kurt Rietzler into his diary in the summer of 1914. Rietzler was private secretary to von Bethmann-Hollweg, the German Chancellor at that time. His previous diary entry reads, "Fate is mostly entirely stupid and unconscious and gets lost in a pure coincidence. But it's all become so multifactored that it's in this damned, confused modern world impossible to calculate or to understand." 7 days later, World War I began. Rietzler's words aptly captured our age too, not because we are facing the immediate outbreak of a world war, but too many factors at once. It is also a very befitting description of today's international situation. Anybody striving towards uniting Europe will need to remember to step in the shoes of the most vulnerable countries or any given issue, to look at these from their perspective and allow this insight to influence its own policies. If talking security policy, we need to look at the points of view of the Baltic nations and Poland. In the case of fiscal and economic policy, it's the southern European countries whose perspective we need to take. And with regard to refugee policy, we need to keep Italy's concerns foremost in mind. It will not do criticizing the American first approach and then taking the same approach at home. That's especially a lesson we Germans have to learn. We Germans in particular tend at times to think that we are the only ones with appropriate ideas for the course of action Europe needs to take. Even if we act with the best of intentions, as for example in the case of the refugee crisis in 2015, we need to consider what others in Europe think about it before we make our move. This issue of migration policy has certainly caused serious ruptures in Europe's fabric. Right-wing nationalism is on the rise, but there is also a liberal variation of the old nationalist thinking that the German way is the right way for the world, or at least for Europe. So in his straight-talking way, Dahrendorf highlighted a problem, the seriousness of which we are only just coming to understand. The European Union, on its own, cannot carry much weight in world politics. And without the close ties to the United States, it certainly won't be a pertinent factor anyway in the near future. This raises the question as to whether and how we can retain these ties in a new form, and what we as Europeans need to do in order to become a factor in world politics. This includes making use of economic, political, and cultural means and, if necessary, the willingness to deploy military means. Certainly, if there is no real projection of European power, fragile states will not turn to us when they are looking for help and partners. Today, following the constitutional crisis, the euro crisis, and the migration crisis, we have a much greater wealth of experience to look to than Dahrendorf did back in the early 2000s. And not only in terms of the European Union. International terrorism has shaped global politics. Globalization is in crisis, and the global dominance of the United States is gradually becoming history. Despite this, Dahrendorf's words have not lost their relevance. On the contrary, in a changing world order, it is all the more urgent for Europe to focus on its interests, on what it has in common, as a starting point to nurture the power to shape events. In foreign policy in particular, therefore, the European Union will have to rise above itself. In today's troubled world, we Europeans can only assert ourselves if we stand together. Our kids and grandkids will send us to hell if we would go in that direction that Europe is splitting off. I mean, they have only one chance, or an alternative. To have a voice, then it has to be a common voice in Europe, or no voice in the world. That's the only alternative they have. Let's not pretend otherwise. The world sees Europe as rich but weak. That tempts people to engage in intervention and manipulation. And there's one thing that Moscow, Washington, and Beijing have in common: the perception that Europe is not a factor they have to take seriously. But it's not only the strong countries which have no interest in Europe, the weak ones don't have it either, because we don't project any power. Holding on to what we have achieved so far is not enough, since it is always possible that one has accomplished turns out not to be resilient enough. We need to make use of the good times to prepare for the next crisis. That's all that the French president is trying to do. Germany has a major role to play in the search for a robust European foreign policy which is capable of taking action. Germany needs to be ready to shoulder this responsibility, and above all, those holding political responsibility need to be willing to explain it to the people of Germany, to argue for it, to gain approval for it. We have to stop a very wrong narrative, which is very popular in my country, that Germany is a net payer in the European Union. So there is the telling that so we are the only ones who are working, these lazy guys in the south, and we're always paying for them. And the truth is we are the net winners. I mean, you will not be the world's leading exporting nation if you will get more without getting more money in the country than sending money for goods to other countries. And it's not necessarily rocket science to understand that. So after all, in democracies, the capability to engage in strategic policy development ultimately depends on the capabilities to get a majority for it. So far, most of the policymakers have refused to take on this job. I think that has to be changed. If Europe is to stand up successfully for its interests in a liberal, rule-based order, it needs to resolve a twofold dilemma. Internally, it needs to strike a new balance between autonomy and community. Because the Brexiteers are right about one thing: the concept of ever closer union, the concept of the United States of Europe, has failed. But that does not mean that Europe has failed. As we strive to keep the Union together, the significance of nation states will actually tend to increase. And that's not a bad thing, because we still have no better point of reference for the rule of law, democracy, and liberty than the national constitutions, whether written or unwritten. In view of these challenges, our lack of an appropriate understanding of how to position the European Union is almost scary. We are treating the European Union as if we had a spare one in the cupboard. In this situation, the election of a strongly pro-European president in France is a stroke of luck in historic dimensions. Never before has a French president called Europe's sovereignty a precondition for the sovereignty of his own nation. Macron has recognized the downward spiral in which the EU finds itself. He has compared it to a civil war. There is finger-pointing, there are open threats, there are blockades, knife-edge votes, and not least poisonous cliches. Tensions between the governments and the EU have increased. And when the governments blame the negotiations in Brussels, they make it easier for the media to keep identifying new battlefronts. The South against the North, the West against the East. The ones allude to at the beginning of my remarks. The poet Eugen Roth once wrote, and I apologize that the translation loses the rhyme, felling a fine tree takes less than half an hour. Growing it enough to admire it takes a century. So tragically, just as the current global situation requires the European Union to take more action in foreign policy, the EU seems to be gradually losing its grip on its internal project of reconciliation. Silence is replacing dialogue. Technocracy is dominating policy making in many areas, and the distance from the people of Europe, from their concerns and their needs is growing. There was a very famous president of the Commission, a French socialist, Jacques Delors, he said, "Nobody will fall in love with a common market." And that's true. It's not enough to convince people about Europe. That is why I say that we need to reverse course if, in a few years' time, we are not to be standing before the ruins of the European Union and standing helpless before the world. We need to give Europe back its soul. Emmanuel Macron very passionately, as perhaps only a French courtisan can, summed up what holds us together in his speech at the opening of this year's Frankfurt Book Fair. Macron, who is a very well-read politician, described how, in many cases, it were German and French authors who understood the works from the other culture particularly well and prepared them for a wider audience in both countries. He spoke about how it was the German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin who brought him closer to the great French poet Baudelaire. It's probably true that you need distance to perceive what is special. So Europeans, and we Germans and French in particular, have learned that what is different doesn't have to threaten or call into questions one's own identity. Au contraire. The opposite in the case, and here I totally agree with Macron, the differences between us and our closest neighbors actually sustains our own identity, the French and the German, and also the European. And it is precisely this diversity which makes Europe strong. And a Europe that is a project which has something to offer to what is currently such a violent and conflict-ridden world. The proof that enemies can become partners and then even friends. Even today, it is a miracle that the very people who suffered from most German terror invited us, as I said, to come back to the table of civilized countries in Europe. So Dahrendorf terms will still have a lot of work ahead of us as Germans and as Europeans. Do we have the strength to do it? I don't know, but we have to try, and we have to begin by defining our interests. That raises questions of power, and things immediately get uncomfortable. Much more uncomfortable for us Europeans and Germans as it was in the time where the Americans did all the jobs outside for us, and we always had somebody to blame or to pay. If it went good, then we paid. If not, we blamed. So that was a very comfortable and easy way. This time is over. So It raises questions of power and things immediately get uncomfortable, as I said. But how has Willy Brandt put it? He said, it may be true that power ruins people's characters, but the same is equally true of powerlessness. So let's not sit back and claim that we are powerless. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much for your wide-ranging remarks that not only cover Germany and Europe, but world politics and the changes in world politics. We have a little time for debate. There will be microphones. Prepare your questions. I want to start with one. You used that wonderful expression, Germany will need to do what it takes to support Europe. You also refer to the Schwaben, I mean this mentality of really sitting on the pennies. And at the end, you actually briefly refer to that question. There is a great deal of resentment that Germany is not exercising its role to do whatever it takes to help those in Europe that need support. So how should Germany in this situation behave? We know that electorally it's not very popular to do that. What should a German politician do as he looks ahead at the situation of Europe, at the anti-European forces in Germany, to deal with that very problem?
I can only speak about my own experiences, and I would say it is not so difficult to explain to people who work, for example, at Volkswagen, that they will lose their jobs if the rest of Europe is not able to buy a Volkswagen because people are unemployed. And we are an exporting country. 60% of our exports are in Europe and more than 40% in the Eurozone. So you have to speak the truth to the people. And I mean, my constituency is a heavily industrialized constituency. So I have many people who have less universities than Harvard, but more car production sites and machineries, electricity, chemicals. And it never was difficult to explain people, if you really want to speak to them and to speak with them, that it's not only a question of peace, it's also a question of their own jobs, to invest in the prosperity and the unity of the European Union. And by the way, now we are in an excellent economic situation in Germany. And I mean, there is a criticism coming not only from the US, also from other parts of the world, to ask us why your trade surplus is so high. So there is good reason economically to invest more in Europe, in research and development, in defense and common institutions. I would say it doesn't mean to take anybody something or to take it from the ordinary citizens. We have an economic excellent performance, so if we are not able to invest now in Europe, when will we do so?
You made a very important point about the long-term prospect of the transatlantic relationship, that it may very well be that Donald Trump stays in power, and whatever happens, it will not be the same after he's gone. But he's there. How would you define the strategy? What should the Europeans do now in this situation? Trump is there, he's going to stay, possibly for another 8 years, another 6 years. What should be, well, 2 plus possibly another 4. We don't know. What should be Europe's strategy in this situation, as he is obviously questioning the very essence of the system that the United States created, and you refer to that?
First of all, the precondition is that Europe has a united position on trade, on defense, on international politics. The biggest danger is that Mr. Trump and also other forces in the world could split off Europe in different parts. They tried to do this in the past, and Donald Trump was not the first president who tried this. Remember the debate about the Iraq War and where the Americans saw there is the old Europe and the new Europe. I mean, that's not the first time. By the way, we overcame all these difficulties. I mean, there's also a successful story in Europe that we managed the euro crisis, then we managed the difficulties in respect to the US. So first and foremost, we have to do whatever we can to help to hold Europe united. Second, I would invest much more in the transatlantic cooperation, but not in the way we did it in the past. I mean, German politicians, we like and we love to go to California, to New York, to DC, and of course to Boston. We met all the traditional friends of the transatlantic cooperation. But which kind of relation we do have to the young Hispanics, to the civil society, to the Afro-Americans? We love to discuss with those who have European roots because there's a common understanding. And we have to invest much more to the other parts of the United States because, I mean, the United States of tomorrow will not be the same as today, but it's not for sure that the transatlantic relation will be in the center of the perspective of the next generation of politicians in this country. And so we should invest much more and give much more interest to those parts of the United States which we do not really know. Mm-hmm. When I was Minister for Foreign Affairs, I started the idea of a German-American year. They just started at the 3rd of October, I think so. Yep. Mainly with an Oktoberfest. That's my okay.
And we had an event at Harvard.
Yeah.
On the second day.
I told my colleagues, you should go to those parts of the United States where German companies have their industrial flats. I mean, the majority of the Germans, and I'm sure the majority of the Americans, do not know that the biggest industrial site of BMW is not in Germany or Europe. It's in Spartanburg in South Carolina. And there are a lot of companies who are delivering jobs to the American citizens. I said, you should go with a big truck on the Times Square and invite some thousand industrial workers from German companies in the United States to show what kind of cooperation we have. So to make it much more visible what kind of cooperation we had in the future. And I mean, that's a great treasure. We should not give it away. So invest more in the new transatlantic cooperation.
Thank you. So now we can start. Grzegorz Ekiert first. We need the microphone.
Microphones are on the ceiling. We don't need to, right?
No? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for that speech, which I find very pessimistic, almost to the core. But
which was realistic.
If your realism is very pessimistic. But let me ask a question about, you used the metaphor of speaking softly and carrying a big stick. You mostly apply it to international relations, in which Europe is involved. What about internal EU politics? We have Italians just flanking the budgetary rules. We have Hungarians and Poles, attacking judiciary and rule of law and so on. Should EU carry a big stick in the internal conflicts and problems of that sort, or EU should speak softly, hoping that those people will really change their ways through persuasion?
The biggest stick for the Italians are the financial markets, not the European Commission. If the financial markets will not trust the Italian policy, and the precondition is that the Europeans are not willing to give more space to this kind of policy, then I think the the Italians will see and will be maybe much more flexible for negotiations. I mean, I would say if the Italians would ask for higher deficit spending, for more investment against unemployment, or more investment for research and development, for sustainable growth, for all what they did not do in the past. I mean, the reality is that the productivity of the country was not very high. The taxation system was very difficult. So there are a lot of Italian companies who want to invest, but not in Italy. So if they would ask for more flexibility on the side of the debt for this position, I would say yes. I mean, that's fine. We the Germans, maybe we would not like to say it to the public, but the reality was, when we were in the middle of the crisis, we did not reach the Maastricht criteria, and we had a combined policy to reform our social structure and to have higher deficits, because at the same time we want to invest in education, in renewable energies, and so on and so forth. If he would have done it in a different way, to reduce or to reform the social structures and to reduce the deficit, the unemployment rate would have gone up. So if the Italian government would ask for that, I would say fine. Unfortunately, the two parties, they would like to raise their budget in a very unsustainable way. The one part, the Lega, want to reduce taxes for the rich ones, and the other wants to hire the social benefits for the poor ones, without any idea how the country could come in a better competitive situation. So that's the reason I would say there we have to be very strict and clear, give not room for too big maneuvers, and then the market will react. Second, in the political issue is much more difficult. I mean, what means to have a big stick? What does it mean? We do not have a legal opportunity to exclude Hungary or Poland. I would say the Conservative Party should exclude their sister party in Hungary, because it has nothing to do with the normal Conservative Party in Europe. This would be a signal. It's the other way around. The Bavarian Conservatives invited Orban to their party congress. I mean, there is, by the way, there is a pro-European conservative from Bavaria who is running for the presidency of the European Union. At the same time, his own party is inviting Orban. So Macron said it's very difficult to be on the one hand side on pro-Merkel and pro-Orban. So, I mean, that's much more difficult to react. I would say that there is a situation where Europe could not do nothing if the independence of judiciary will be eradicated from the landscape of Hungary and Turkey. Then we have to react with our financial budget. There we can do something. So it's impossible to give credit to the fundamentals of the European Union, but it's very difficult. I mean, the guys in Hungary and Poland will immediately use, especially if it comes from Germany, for their internal debate. So that's the reason we as Germans, we have to be careful about speaking too loudly against them. It's better that others can do this. We have, I mean, the Polish guys have some experience with us Germans. Not the best one, huh? And we always should be careful. History and geography also defines our future, even in the times of data-driven economy. At the end of the day, history and geography defines the future. But I'm not pessimistic, by the way. Or I'm not. But to say the truth is the first thing to change the situation.
Next question, over there.
Yes, I think it's this broad sweep and this wide-ranging format on the subject of Europe that I, over the last 30 years, have come to associate with the Center for European Studies. And I might add also with Guido Goldman. So thank you very much. You've given us the big picture.
You can say the truth, it was too long.
I'm getting there. Yes, the big picture. And I appreciate also that you've taken a position firmly away from the vegetarian and towards the flexitarian. I thought at that point in your lecture, you might move a bit out of the stratosphere and come down to earth a bit more. And then you presented three possibilities, the G0, the G2, and the GX. And the GX was the one you embraced, given its multipolarity. I'm just wondering, how can we address the dilemmas you have mentioned and the difficulties, given at the moment, well, the disarray, or at any rate, the fragmentation of the German party system. Both of the major parties have lost significantly in the last two elections in Hesse and Bayern. And there's more fragmentation across the political landscape than we have seen in maybe, well, for quite a while. Can I bring you down to earth? Is your position of internationalism within your own party a mainstream position? Or would it be a mainstream position in the CDU?
In the CDU, it is a mainstream position, the Social Democratic not. But that doesn't mean that the Social Democrats should not talk about that. I mean, there is, my party loves to see back in the golden age of the 70s of the last century. And even in my speech, I mentioned Willy Brandt, and you will not find a Social Democrat in Germany who minimum quoted Willy Brandt in every speech for 3 times. And it's not so easy to convince the party first to confront itself with the present situation and to look beyond the country. There is a tendency in Germany, because of the excellent economic situation, that we first think what's good for the party, then we think now we look to Germany, then we look to Europe, and then to the rest of the world. I would prefer to do it the other way around, to look what's happening in the world, what does this mean for Europe, what does this mean for Germany, and then what kind of reaction the party should have. I'm not so pessimistic that the situation will not be better. By the way, I'm not pessimistic about the fragmentation of the party system. I mean, to be honest, we are a much more individualistic world in the democratic states than we have been before. So what you see in the German parliament is the consequence of a much more individualistic country, because the country is richer. I have a good explanation with the Turkish voters. Normally, Turkish voters who are allowed to vote in Germany, they voted for more than 90% for the Social Democrats. Now we are absolutely angry and disturbed because Turkish voters vote also for conservatives, Greens, and liberals. So why? And I told my party, it's a good signal. It's good. They developed themselves in the same way we did it. So it's not the poor East Anatolia farmer who lives in Germany who put all his hopes in the Workers' Party social democracy. There are people with completely different social and a better social situation. So they also change their political position. They switch to other parties. It's a good development. The question will be, do we have political leaders which are able to build bridges, which are able to form governments with a majority in the parliament, with a stable government? This, of course, is much more difficult than it was in the past, but it's not impossible. And we saw it in many other European countries in the past. So there is a more fragmented, everybody is concerned about what's happening in Germany. Normally there are 2 big parties and some smaller ones, and now it's changing. I would not be too concerned about that. The question only is, are there political leaders which are able to form governments and majorities? But more parties also can mean that people felt more represented in the parliament than they did before. And by the way, the right-wing populist movement, I mean, what was the result of the two regional elections you mentioned? They had 11% in Bavaria, and they had 13% in Hessen. In the opinion polls, the people thought they might become 20 or 18. So they were far below their own expectations. Why? People went to the election. They didn't want to have a too strong alternative for Germany, a right-wing populist party in the parliament. So normally in Germany, it's a bit like the midterms in the US. It's in Germany below 60% is the turnout of the voters in the regional elections. And now it went up to more than 70% in Bavaria. So people said, no, we don't want to bring our country, our regional state, too much or too close to the right-wingers. We don't want to have them in the parliament. So you should not be too scared about this situation.
Next question.
With raising anti-Semitism, not only in Germany, do you think that the European Union can and should find a way to handle this problem?
Why the European Union should do that?
Because it's as well in France, it's everywhere, but I mean, we as Germans are hit by it.
It's a bit provocative, my question, why the European Union? Because my fear is we only search somebody who's responsible to fight anti-Semitism. We should do it for ourselves. I mean, the German parliament decided to have a special agent against anti-Semitism in the German parliament. I ask myself, I would say every member of the parliament is responsible to fight against anti-Semitism. Every teacher should do this. Every people in the economy, every trade unionist, every citizen of the country. So if we would bring it to the European level, it maybe is an excuse for the national politics not to do something. And by the way, there are special challenges especially for Germany. I mean, we had all these anti-Semitism under the earth, under the surface for many years. It never have been eradicated totally from our country. It was always, I'm one of the politicians who sometimes criticize the Israeli government. that was always difficult because you got applause from the wrong side. It's easy. You can criticize Netanyahu, and next day, you will have in the opinion polls 95% of the Germans on your side. That's a dangerous signal, because under the surface of criticism, the Israeli government, there's a lot of anti-Semitism. So that was always the case. But now we have a new form of anti-Semitism. We opened the borders for refugees out of Syria. I can explain you there. I'm taking care of a family where the 12-old, the son of the family, 12 years old, he lost both legs, the right hand and the right eye, through a rocket, and his father lost his leg. And so my family, we took care about them. And they are very kind people. You can discuss whatever you want. If it comes to two issues, then it becomes difficult. First, questions of homosexuality. Second, as anti-Semitism. Because they got it with the mother milk. For them, Jews are the arch enemies, like for my grandma, the French were. So, send our best greetings. No. So, this is a new challenge. And the young Turkish and Arab students in our school ask the teacher, why I have to learn something about Auschwitz? I'm not responsible. This was the responsibility of the Germans. I'm Turkish, I'm Arab. What I have to do with Auschwitz? And we have to tell them, if you want to live in this country, there is a special responsibility for the security of Jews in our country and in Israel and elsewhere in the world. So this is a complete new challenge. So I didn't want to give it to the European level. I want that every teacher, every policeman, every head of a sports club, every citizen is willing to do something against anti-Semitism in my country and not looking to the European level. It's a too easy excuse. That's why I'm a bit scary about Europe.
Thank you. Well, could we?
No, please.
Yes, sir.
No,
All right.
please.
Please make it short.
It's not enough to establish somebody who cares for all the Jews and giving him no budget at all. That's what Klein told me personally.
I agree, but this is also a kind of, we are searching for a person who is responsible. I want that every teacher uses his capabilities in school to fight against anti-Semitism. I want that in the sports club, when somebody is acting against Jews or make jokes about Jews, then the trainer and the comrade should intervene, not to close the ears and say, we are here to make sports, the rest is not our job. No, it's not. It's a civil society who has to act, and so that's the reason I was not so happy about the special person, although I know that he's doing a great job. But I had the feeling that politicians always search somebody you can say, look, he's responsible, not me, he. And therefore, I'm a bit scary.
Since we are running out of time, I think we should have some young voices here. So let's have 3 short questions, and then perhaps you can answer them together. 1, 2, and 3. All right, go ahead.
On Sunday, the deadline set by the White House expires to put in place the sanctions for Iran. What do you think the European Union or the member states do now that would be equivalent to, I don't know, eating a turkey Caesar salad, using your example?
Okay, thank you. You're on. Very good.
Thank you very much for the lecture. What do you think needs to change, or what do you think needs to happen practically for the European Union to become a superpower in the world?
That's sum enough.
All right, thank you for this presentation. My question is about Russia. You addressed several international clash points where Europe failed to address. And one of them is Ukraine and the land grabbing of Russia in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. I believe you visited the area and you are closely informed about it. Where Europe, and particularly Germany, failed in containing Russia's emboldened acts.
So first, I'm sure that the European Union will try to keep its commitment to the JPCOA, even also after the decision of the United States, and the European Union tries to implement a body for financing economic investments in Iran and vice versa, which is independent from the dollar and independent from the secondary sanctions which the US are always imposing in their own capabilities. We think that's against international law, but nevertheless, the dollar is so strong. So that's the way we try to balance, but it will depend on the situation in the Iran. The Iran, I mean, what I think if I would be an Iranian politician, I would say, oh, that's interesting. If you have the nuclear weapon, like North Korea, then the United States president will come to visit you, and in the end he will say, we are friends. If you are so stupid not to develop nuclear weapons and to make treaties with these weak Europeans, then you will be punished with sanctions to the US. So this is the debate in the Iran. The decision in the United States, where I believe is much more linked to the domestic issue than to foreign policies, this is an argument on the silver tablet to the hardliners which are against Rouhani and the others. So, by the way, there is something which is correct in the criticism of the United States against Iran. The behavior of the Iran in the region is very dangerous. And our approach was to say to the United States, let's address all these behavior with the Iran, but let's keep the JCPOA in place. The situation will not be better without the JCPOA. It will be even worse. That was our argument. It's not an argument against the criticism of the Iran, because there are a lot of reasons to criticize them. The question is, what will happen inside the Iran? The situation is very dangerous there. It's very fragile and unstable. That's the reason I will go to Iran mid of November to listen to the people there. So that would be my answer. I would be happy if Europe would be a power. And therefore, of course, we have to, I would say the defense issue, it's maybe one of the fields where Europe have common interests between North and South and East and West. So defense policy, it's maybe not only necessary because of the defense, it's also an anchor to keep Europe united. That the Polish would agree to defense issues, as well as the French, the Spanish, the Netherlands, the Germans. So that's something we should use also as an instrument to develop Europe. I think there is a possibility. I don't know what will happen during the last years, but I always ask my German fellows, what do you think, what will be the consequences if Libya would come to the government of national unity? Unfortunately, it will not be the case in December, but imagine it is so. Then the Libyan government would say, yes, we also want to stop the human traffic into Europe and to Germany, because the majority of the people are not Libyans. They came out of Central Africa and so on. So we will do that. But then then it's necessary to fight against the militias, because the militias are controlling these so-called detention centers where some German ambassadors said these are concentration camps. So we, as Libyans, we are not able to fight against them. Who would join us? Maybe the Americans would say, that's not our job. Then they will ask the French. They would say, yes, we are willing to do, but not alone. What's about the Germans? And the question is, are we able to have a strategic debate in the upcoming years that Germany not as like a dog of Pavlov say, no, not we. So then let's discuss if it's necessary, if not, what are the instruments, what can we do? So therefore we need a more tradition of strategic debates in the public. German politicians love to do strategic debates behind closed doors. We always underestimate our citizens. So we think, and by the way, I'm not arguing for this or that direction. I'm only arguing that we need to have a public debate, and then at the end, people will decide in elections which way they will like to follow. I mean, that's something very special in Germany. Nobody knows why we need political parties, so maybe then we have a new argument. So I would say this is necessary to have strategic debates inside Europe, and especially in Germany. Then the question to Russia and the Ukraine. I mean, if we would have more time, I would answer provocative, why did we fail? What should we do in Ukraine? Should we go to war against Russia? I mean, what happened there was that after the invasion of Russia in Crimea and the starting of the civil war in the east of Ukraine, there was a point where the United States debated under Obama to deliver heavy weapons to the Ukraine. We warned the Ukrainian soldiers and the Ukrainian government not to try to have a military victory against the so-called rebels, because they, of course, would have the chance to have a victory against the rebels, but not against the country behind the rebels. There was a theory in the United States which said, we will not win the battle against the Russians, but if there are many dead soldiers on the Russian side, maybe then they are more willing to negotiate about peace. It's a tough That's a tough idea to send weapons and to make out of the crisis in the Ukraine a war outside the Ukraine. And Europe decided that's not the right way. And the Chancellor Merkel and the President Hollande decided to go to Kiev and to Moscow. And for the first time, by the way, they acted as Europeans in a European sovereignty. They said, that's our conflict. We don't want to be, we don't want to see that the decision is made in Washington. It's far away. It's our responsibility to do something. Then they came to the Minsk agreement. Why the Ukrainian government accepted the Minsk agreement? Because they were in front of a military defeat. They did not accept the Minsk agreement. Why they agreed to the Minsk agreement? There was never an ownership in the Ukraine about the Minsk agreement. And you can see it today. Ask the SMM, the International Supervisor Group. You will see every day they are shooting each other, both sides. Both sides do, they during the night, they're going to the other side of the border, then they shoot in their own direction. Next day they have an argument to say, look, last night they shoot on us, now we should react. It's not my interpretation. You should ask the SMM, the International Supervisor said. So the conflict is much too deep, and I don't think that there is a possibility to solve it through the Minsk agreement or through the both sides. We need an international engagement. I would prefer, as top #1 issue of the German membership in the Security Council from the 1st January 2019, to put this question on the table: how to come to robust UN Blue Helm mandate, which means UN troops with weapons to control the ceasefire and to withdraw the heavy weapons out of the region. It's interesting, we discussed it with Putin for 3 years, he always rejected it. Then at the General Assembly 2017, he accepted it, but by conditions which are unacceptable for the Ukrainians and for us. But I think we should push him forward and negotiate about that. For me, it's the only outcome for in the situation, to stop the shooting, and then, of course, to invest in the reconstruction of the east of Ukraine. Therefore, the European Union, Germany, is willing to do that. But the precondition is ceasefire and withdrawal of heavy weapons. And therefore, you need an international, robust mandate. Without it, you will not come. So that would be my proposal.
Well, I'm afraid we have to end. I'm very sorry.
I'm also sorry. I would love to hear.
Yeah, there's. I don't know. You're the. Do you give us an extension for a question? You're the director. It's 6:05.
Why don't we have that?
All right, an extension. All right, let's go on, please.
Is it, of course, they're all important issues. Go ahead.
Negotiations.
Yeah.
Thank you for addressing my question. The negotiations for the Donbass always kept separately from the Crimean issue. How do you think it is kind of getting out of the agenda? How are your impressions about Crimea's reunification or returning back?
I don't think that there's a solution in front of us for Crimea. I don't think so. No, and by the way, there's a different kind of sanctions for Crimea and for the east of and the conflict in the east of Ukraine. And there you can see that the international community exactly knows that the Crimea issue would be a long-standing issue and a frozen conflict, but that the international community wants to be concentrated on the situation on the east of Ukraine. And I think that's a very pragmatic approach. By the way, when I met representatives of the new administration in the US and I asked them what should we do together in respect to the Ukraine, the answer was, that's not our business. They said, what do you say? And then my colleague said, you should not blame me for what I'm said. I only wanted that you know how my president is thinking. I don't know, it's 1 year ago, 1.5 years. Sometimes the ideas of your president changing. But it was for us. It was a bit disturbing, huh?
But the gentleman is no longer there.
Unfortunately, not.
No. No, well, please join me in thanking Sigmar Gabriel.
Okay.
Wunderbar.